There's a rule about the right size of holes in Swiss cheese. By the way, it's between 3/8 and 3/4. That requires a compliance officer, so-called onboarding process required. Like I had to go and testify before a certified HR professional that I wasn't a member of the Communist Party. Bureaucracy begets bureaucracy, right?
Today's guest is Barry Lam, professor of philosophy at the University of California at Riverside, and he's the author of the recent book, Fewer Rules, Better People, The Case for Discretion. So, Barry, just for people that haven't read your book, what's the 30-second elevator synopsis of it or thesis of it?
Sure. The primary thesis of the book is that in important institutions of society, like in criminal justice, in government, other bureaucracies, education, maybe even banks, healthcare, things like that, there are strong pressures to evolve toward having more rules, more complex rules, and more top-down and algorithmic enforcement of those rules. And I think there are very good reasons for these rules, but this kind of evolution, the net result is actually bad. Like it's bad for society. It's bad for the institutions themselves. It's bad for effective or efficient governance. And I actually think it's bad for the moral character of the individuals who are in the institutions and the individuals who are governed by the institutions. So the call to action is that we should increase the amount of discretion people have in living against both the people who the rules are supposed to govern and the people within the institutions that are supposed to do the governing and the enforcement of those rules.
In your book, chapter 6 is called The Coming of the Robot Rulers. And I was recently reading David Graeber's book, The Utopia of Rules. And he wrote this book in 2015. And he says that we live in an era of total bureaucratization. And I was thinking like that was, 10 years ago.
Yeah. It's even worse. Yeah.
Right. I'm like, well, of course, he passed away in 2020. But I was like, man, if he thought that in 2015 we lived in total bureaucratization, what would he think about 2025, especially with AI, as you mentioned in this chapter 6, Coming of the Robot Rulers, about how you could have an electric car. I mean, basically, what your speed is at all times is recorded. How far away you are from other vehicles. Are you on your phone texting? I mean, there's a camera on you the whole time. I mean, that's at a whole nother level of bureaucracy. So
somebody has that data. I mean, it's there. Yeah. It's there. And so far they're not doing anything with it in terms of enforcement, but it's not even a leap. It's like a very small step.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is it's really just a matter of changing some rules where it's like, okay, yeah, the data from the car can now be essentially used to incriminate you. I guess the real question is, how far off are we from having that kind of be the norm?
I think it's very close, and it depends on a lot of decisions that policymakers make and whether citizens will put up with it. When I say very close, I mean like a year. Maybe 2. I mean, wow. Maybe we can reserve this for a much more extended discussion, but there was this whole announcement, this whole like celebration, apparently, that the Trump administration was going to go in and slash federal bureaucracy, right? Everything that we've seen, and if we're only about 2 weeks in, has indicated, and there's lots of good reporting about this in Wired and in other news program, is that one of the aims that Elon Musk has is to automate using AI a lot of the things that the federal government was doing. It's not to slash the bureaucracy. It's to automate. I mean, he wants AI in air traffic control. He wants AI in the auditing of Social Security. I mean, all that's right. Like so. If people just put up with it, it could happen within a year, right?
I mean, I think like you kind of got to this early in your book, and this is the question, is basically you talk about like, who do you mistrust more? Do you mistrust humans more, or do you mistrust the machines? And I would imagine if you ask the average person, I would imagine most people say they mistrust people more than they would mistrust machines. So if you're going to automate the bureaucracy, would the average person think that's bad or good, or they just think it's neutral? I mean, what's
I think that people, we're coming out of COVID, we are at the lowest point of trust in people. Period. So we are at a very low point in our trust of people. Trust in individuals and trust in institutions were maybe a high point, I don't know, in the 50s or so. And then like starting in the late 60s and 70s, it started to dip for very good reason. But I think it's selective, right? I don't think that people mistrusted the FAA, right? I don't think people mistrusted air traffic controllers. I still think they don't. But it depends on who they're going to blame, like if there are more accidents, right? I don't think people mistrusted Social Security payments or like that, or the person who was helping you at the office to like apply for disability, right? There was mistrust of public health officials because of the pandemic. There's a high level of mistrust of news media. I don't know if you were asked, like if you ask people about their mistrust of the media, whether they would say that, oh, well, let's like automate the Associated Press. Like, let's just have like AI, like churn out the news stories that you're going to read, whether they like it's comparative. I don't know if people are going to trust machines more than humans. I know we're at a low point in the mistrust of people, but fancy me skeptical that people are going to trust. Like, are they going to trust the robot therapist more than their therapist? Right? It's an open question. Are people going to mistrust their doctor's diagnosis or an AI diagnosis? If you ask me, I don't even know how to answer that. I think it's completely selective. Do people trust their cabbie or Uber driver more than a Waymo automated car? Like, I think it's going to be in different contexts, different answers.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the context is probably key. I mean, there's a massive difference between having an AI cop versus having an AI doctor, but there's also a massive difference even within the doctors, though, between having someone perform surgery on you versus someone that's going to diagnose you, like say the GP versus the cardiologist or something. But
right.
I would say, like in the medical profession, I mean, at least maybe the doctor's not motivated by writing you a prescription. Maybe you would actually get more balanced, like a more fair treatment versus them just like putting you on a statin because they're getting some kickback or whatever. If you're getting pulled over by a cop and you're an attractive female, maybe you can flirt your way out of that.
Right.
But if it's a robot cop, so I think the context, is definitely key for all these.
Yeah. I mean, so the starting point for a lot of, forget about cops, forget about doctors and things for a second. So just in terms of enforcement of rules and laws, right? You could have, as we currently do, officers doing traffic enforcement, or you could have cameras, data from your car, right? Like literally like that kind of stuff. I don't know how people would think about this, because on the one hand, the cars, I mean, I guess they could malfunction. Your speedometer could malfunction, right? Or your sensor could malfunction, but if you're going faster than the speed limit, it knows, right? If you run a red light, the camera's got the picture. The experiment we have in California is that nobody's paid those like pictured speeding tickets for some reason. Like people hated it and still do. But the cameras are still there. It's still like surveilling everybody. We're talking about enforcement being governed by rules versus being governed by people. I feel like when I talk to people, it's the scariest thing for them to think that officers, prosecutors, and judges, like you're brought before a judge, for instance, and you like make your case, And sometimes you make your case like this, I know I was speeding, but you know what? Like, I got a call from the school. My kid was, sick, blah, blah, or you say something and, you take your chances with a human being that may or may not understand or may not believe you. Compare that to they're just running the data, right? Like, how many people in your situation were telling the truth? 68%, right? So it's like crunching a probability. There's a 68% you're telling the truth. And and even if you're telling the truth, like, if you run an automated sentencing program, right? Like that says this person is going to get, you lose all human flexibility and all human chance. So you're going to get consistency at the cost of like the ability to persuade somebody that you're in one of those situations where they shouldn't punish you for something, right? Do we want that? Right? Do we want that?
What was kind of the impetus for writing this book? I mean, it came out, I believe, it is 2025. It was fairly recent, right?
February 11th. It just came out less than a month ago.
Yeah. So you're talking 2025, but I wasn't sure if it, was it precipitated by, the pandemic where, we had lockdowns and a lot of people kind of had some issues with some of the policies that were going on now, especially with ChatGPT and all the kind of like the AI arms race. So was it kind of, because especially you said chapter 6, coming of the robot rulers. So there's a lot different. I wasn't right. Your book was fairly short. I mean, I think it was like 130 pages or something. Yeah. So you did, a lot of authors will kind of like get into the reason. I was just kind of curious, like, what was the actual? I mean, granted, you're also a professor of philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, so maybe you had to write it against your will by one of your robot.
No, I didn't have to write this against my will. Okay. So my interest started in criminal justice because I did a season of my podcast, Hi-Phi Nation, which you see right here, on the relationship between philosophical issues and the criminal justice system. And I thought I was going to talk about free will and whether we should punish. And I talked a little bit about that stuff. But when I was talking to practitioners of it, officers, defense attorneys, prosecutors, judges, they were interested in the issue of discretion, right? Versus top-down mandates, right? Of rule and law enforcement. And that is what started me thinking about that issue. And then I started becoming, I'm a very, I get irritated. I have very little patience for unnecessary bureaucracy. And I moved from New York to California, from one pretty bureaucratic state to probably the most bureaucratic state. Because when you're involved, so, I ended up taking a job. So officially I work for the state, and I went through this whole process of, just getting hired, which is great, you get a job, get hired. But the so-called onboarding process required, like, I had to go and testify before a certified HR professional that I wasn't a member of the Communist Party. I had to get health insurance, but because they were 2 months late in hiring me, I officially couldn't enroll in health insurance unless I got a waiver from the provost about this, that, and the other. My wife had to transfer her teaching credential, which was a 6 to 9 month process of bureaucrats making sure that the math class you took in 1998, right, had greater than 70% numerical reasoning, something or other, right? And like there was just all of this stuff that was involved. And then you go into everybody will know this, the American healthcare system and things that are involved in billing. And why the hell am I getting billed for something my insurance covered? And it just turns out that, they threaten you with a bill so that you will like rush to the insurance, so you could send the claim to your insurance company so that the insurance company is in a fight with like the hospital about. There's just all kinds of stuff that was in the background, and like the thought about the criminal justice world and just the irritation that I had with what I consider to be unnecessary paperwork and red tape It's kind of like led to the book.
In your book, you talk a lot about legalism. I mean, you want to kind of explain legalism and how this relates to bureaucracy?
Yeah. So legalism, like there's the small L legalism and the big L legalism. And my editor made sure I put that there. So the small L legalism, what everybody understands to be legalism, namely fine print, complex rules, right? So it's like pay your taxes is like a good rule, but then it's like, oh, well, then these exemptions, but then there are exceptions to the exemptions, right? So like if you have up to a certain point in like one example I use in the book is like, suppose you get a prize, for like the Nobel Prize or something. Like, is that taxable income? No, it's not taxable unless you had some reason to, like, you entered the prize. If you just given the prize, that's not taxable. But you entered the prize, well, that's more like a competition. So like if you win from Jeopardy, then that's supposed to be taxable. But if you win the Nobel and so on, legalism is the idea that there are hundreds and hundreds of rules that govern your life or your job, and that the evolution of your job, for instance, is more rules. So in my line of work, you're just teaching, right? You're like, oh, I'm going to teach some kids. You create a syllabus, and the syllabus is just what's the reading and what are the assignments. But over the course of the last 10 years, we had to add like more and more paragraphs in it, right? So like the first, it was like, make sure they know that if they have a learning disability, that there are resources available at this center. So then you add that to the syllabus. Make sure that if you have certain content that can be disturbing to then you add like a disclaimer, and you tell them the week that happens. Okay, then you add that disclaimer. Okay, make sure you talk about AI cheating and the sort of thing, and then you add that disclaimer. Like, we have disclaimers that are like 1.5 pages for like a 1-page syllabus, right? That's legalism, right? Like legalism is the idea that as you go along in life, in your job, or there are going to be more and more complex rules and somebody there to enforce it, compliance officer, right? And so forth. Big L legalism is actually a political philosophy from ancient China, which is very close to small L legalism. So the legalists in ancient China were trying to do something that a lot of societies have been trying to do since, which is unify a country to live together and govern together and collect the same taxes and have the same government. But the people were very different from each other and had different interests. And they had been fighting in wars for centuries and centuries. And how do you do that? So, you could have, that's what you might call an authoritarian of an individual model, where you say, just get somebody who's a super strong person who will be able to crush any dissent and have them be your ruler, right? Well, how do you make sure that they rule well? Well, you kind of like educate them and you try to make them like a great ruler in like the virtues or whatever. Or you can think, well, what we need is a very involved bureaucracy. Right? What we have is a bunch of rules, a bunch of people who are involved in certain jobs in that bureaucracy. They don't stray from their jobs. They have managers. The managers manage like 5-10 people, and the manager is like, has oversight from like a manager above them. And eventually they answer to a central authority. Essentially what China is now today is like a legalistic society. And so it's rule by rules rather than rule by individuals.
What's the difference between legalism and bureaucracy?
The bureaucracy is, I think bureaucracies can be run legalistically, or they could be run non-legalistically. So a bureaucracy is just an institution, right? So the criminal justice system is a bureaucracy, right? Social Security is a bureaucracy. Healthcare is a bureaucracy. Schools are a bureaucracy, right? And so whenever there's bureaucracy, there are going to be rules too, right? But you could have bureaucracies, sort of the way Trump wants to run a bureaucracy, for instance, is a bureaucracy that's not legalistic, but patrimonial. Like, that's a word that's been like out, right? Which is like, he's in charge, and then there are people who curry favor to him, right? And then he returns the favor with something else, right? That's not governed by rules. That's governed by the whims and desires of an individual. Does that make sense? But there's still a bureaucracy. There's still like his cabinet, right? And then there's still like people under them that they manage. There's still the FBI director and the associate FBI director, right? But like, what determines whether they're doing a good job? In a legalistic run bureaucracy, it's did they do the job according to the rule and job description? Right. That's how Hi-Phi, the political philosopher, described the legalism. Right. So it's like, so suppose you're like a doctor, right? You could be in a bureaucratic system. It'd be like, well, what's the standard for the doctor doing well in the hospital? Right. You might think, oh, let's devise a rule for every 100 patients, right? You don't have more than 5 misdiagnoses and complaints and hospitalizations, right? So there's a metric, right? There's a metric, and that is used to evaluate a doctor. The more of those rules that you have on the books, the more you're legalistic as an institution. The alternative would be, well, there's a director, right? And the director just determines whether the doctor's doing well. What's his criteria? Could be whatever he wants. The director just decides, I like that person, right? And, you know, the United States has been moving more from that model towards the legalistic direction.
In the book, you basically, in your intro, you say that you're a bureaucrat. And I mean, you know, the U.S. used to be, you know, a manufacturing economy. It used to be a lot of factory workers, things like that. And now it's more of a service economy, which is, I think, a kind of a euphemism for just saying that it's just a lot of bureaucrats. What percentage of the U.S. economy is actually just a bunch of bureaucrats? I mean, you figure, I mean, just between federal, state, and local employees, you know, quote unquote civil servants, that's like 15% of the workforce. That doesn't include all the government contractors that actually also perform those same activities, just not as employees. I mean, of the 75% that's a service economy, it's got to be a pretty big percent that's just a bureaucrat, right?
Oh, it's huge. It's like, so healthcare is one of the biggest sectors in the U.S. economy, and ask any doctor or nurse, their job has gone from in the past, you know, who's older, you know, like who's like been practicing for a while, their job has gone from being 10% a bureaucrat to like 60% a bureaucrat, right? And what that means is you're a doctor and not a bureaucrat when you're in with a patient with like your stethoscope and your tests and your flashlight, all that stuff, right? Your IVs, that's not bureaucratic. When you have to go to medical billing, right? And you say, okay, now I'm entering into the system exactly what I did, right? And then that's going to go to somebody else who's going to send it to the insurance company for reimbursement. Then you're a bureaucrat, right? So how much of your time is involved in bureaucracy? I would hazard to guess that, so we talk about government bureaucracy, but forget about that. Financial bureaucracy. Like you could have a business and you're a carpenter, right? But there's somebody who's doing the books. That's a bureaucrat, right? Right. Gosh, how much of the economy now is bureaucratic? I couldn't give you a number, but I think it's significantly over 50%, right?
Yeah, because you figure, I mean, a lot of attorneys, I mean, a lot of investment banks. I mean, you look at like a lot of the Ivy League schools. I mean, most of the Ivy League schools have more administrators than students.
No,
like,
that's right.
How do you have more admin than you do students? And we're not even talking about the faculty. We're talking about the admin.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like if you look at the budget, right? And you look, okay, most of the budget is salaries, right? But salaries to whom, right?
Whom?
No, that's absolutely right. Yale has more administrators than they do have students. And that came out 2-3 years ago, something like that, where I saw that.
Like Harvard, Duke. I mean, Duke's not even Ivy, but Duke's, I mean, there's a bunch of the Ivies and quote unquote, elite academic institutions that.
You could hire a private tutor that walks along holding the hands of every student, and you still have more administrators than that. Yeah. So there you go. And you're like, and what do they do? Right. Essentially what a bureaucrat does is collect information, put it into a paper or computerized form and send it along to somebody else. Right. Like Graeber wrote wonderful things about this. Right. And then they think of new ways for that information to it's like reports and memos, but then somebody above that has to collect the 100 reports and memos and make it into one report and memo. Right. So then they collect information and they reduce it into a thing. Right. And send it out. And people think, oh yeah, well, AI is going to come for that. It's going to make it worse. I think. But yeah. So to answer your question, it's enormous.
The next question then is just, do we have too many rules, regulations, and bureaucrats? Then we're speculating well over half the jobs in the U.S. are bureaucrats. It seems, what's the optimal amount? There is such thing as bureaucracy helps organize a society. You have to have some level of bureaucracy, but where is it on a continuum? What's the optimal amount of bureaucracy?
So there is. That's a complicated question that speaks to different answers depending on which sector you're looking at, right? So if you're looking at universities, right, there's this core mission, which is that there are students who come and teachers who teach, right? And then what administration is needed? Well, you need someone to schedule the classes so that not everything is conflicting, right? It's like these poor kids have to take these classes, but they all want to meet at 12 to 1:50 on Mondays and Wednesdays because everybody wants to teach and then get out of it, And it's okay, we need somebody to do that, right? And we need somebody to keep the student records, their GPAs and all that. And we need people to clean the buildings and all that. So when it comes to that stuff, it's what's essential to the operation? And then you're okay, then why do we have so many administrators? Right. And the answer to that question is bureaucracy begets bureaucracy, right? There have been a series of federal mandates that you have to report to the federal government, or you have to have your accounting with receipts that are itemized. There's all these kind of accounting rules and so on. And so you're okay, well, the faculty don't want to do that. We just want to teach, right? And then the administrators who do the class. So then you just hire more administrators who do all that other stuff, right? And so what happens is rules beget more people that need to be in compliance with those rules. And that's the primary answer. It's not the only answer, but it's one of the primary answers. So I think it's not really a question of how big or how many people, because that varies. It's, are the people necessary? And if they're not necessary, are they made necessary because there are rules that don't need to be there, right? So there are rules imposed on universities to send reports to the government or whatever. And that creates more and more administrators. I think we can do without that. Of course, there's all these questions that I get all the time. Well, what about schools that cheat? And that happens, right? There are schools that have been caught cheating on, trying to game the ranking systems, because they okay. Federal government, that's a big one. I don't think the problem with the federal bureaucracy was the number of people. So if you just look at federal employees and not contractors, when Trump took office, it was at the level it was in 1969, just the sheer number of federal employees, when the population was much lower, right? We have 75% more people now than we do in 1969. So if you talk about administering things like food safety, airplane safety, road safety, and Social Security and Medicare and all that stuff. If anything, it was underfunded, but it was very inefficient, right? And it was inefficient because over the course of 60 years, there were many, many, many rules imposed on the federal bureaucracy that in order for them to do something, if you had to purchase a toilet, you have to go through 10 steps. Rather than if you wanted to purchase a toilet, you go to Home Depot, you buy a toilet, right? If a federal employee wanted to, right, there were so many laws that were passed that they have to go through 10 steps that increase the inefficiency and also the cost, right? So I think the problem there was that there were just too many rules on federal employees. In the healthcare sector, it's just a mess, right? It's just a mess of insurance companies trying to not pay there is definitely gouging by hospitals and care providers, but then there's also like private insurance versus Medicare and all this other stuff. So yeah, I think the problem is so complex. Sometimes it's too many rules. Sometimes it's too many people. Sometimes it's just rule compliance. I mean, I'm going to shut up now, but that's a hard question across lots of different bureaucracies.
Since your book is titled "Fewer Rules, Better People," I mean, how many fewer rules do we need, and then how do you make people better?
Yeah, I think we need. Okay, so. Gosh, I think we need fewer rules in some domains and smarter ones, right? So I think we need to build in discretion to rules. Let me give you an example. So there are noise ordinances in every city, right? And you could write your rule this way. Noise that's deemed too loud and disruptive is not allowed. That's it, right? Everybody understands that. They might not like that rule. They might say, that's so vague. What's too loud and disruptive, right? Here's another kind of rule. Between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., no noise emanating from within the property line is to exceed 58 decibels as measured 10 feet outside of the property line by a certain kind of decibel meter. That's actually the rule in my city, right? Now, that's a legalistic rule. It's highly specific, and there are thousands of these on the local level and millions of these at the federal level, governing everything from how high the roof line of your shed has to be, how many feet away from the property line. There's a rule about the right size of holes in Swiss cheese, right? Like it's between 3/8 and 3/4, right? That requires a compliance officer to check your Swiss cheese hole punching machine and maybe even do a spot check on Swiss cheese. And all that. Okay. I think we need fewer ones of those, but not just fewer ones. I think that you just replace them. So that's not making it fewer with a rule like that's too loud and too disruptive, right? There are sounds that are disruptive without being loud. And then you make people think about, is that sound you're making too loud or too disruptive? I like rules that require people to make a judgment call. Right? Sometimes they'll make the wrong judgment, but it also means you have to make a judgment about, okay, well, if somebody calls the cops, are they going to think it's too loud or disruptive? Even if I don't think it's too loud and disruptive. That's I like rules like that, right? Rather than the legalistic ones.
Of all the sectors of U.S. society, what one has the most rules that probably need to get changed? And I got I have a podcast on Thursday with economist Brian Koplin, who just wrote a book called Build. Bill, talking about how the reason that cities like San Francisco, LA, et cetera, have such, or New York City have such sky high housing prices is because they're just regulated to death.
Yeah.
And you actually spend more money on the regulation than you do on the house.
Yes,
which
absolutely.
seems pretty ridiculous that you're actually paying more money for paperwork, and that paperwork, of course, nowadays is mostly digital.
It hasn't made it more efficient. Yeah.
Right. So, housing, that's just one sector that I threw out there, but what is the actual, and I think housing is a good sector because everyone lives in a house or lives in a building, right? That affects every single person. Yeah.
I think housing is a very strong contender to being a top one. Brian Kaplan's absolutely right about that. It's not just zoning, right? So there's like the zoning rules, and they're very legalistic. It's also construction in LA. It's like you have to have 2.5 parking spots for every unit of an apartment. Like you could imagine what that adds. There's a lot of, I would say building there are essentially certain things that American society just cannot do anymore. Building housing is one of them, and administering effective healthcare is another one. And building infrastructure is yet a third. Building and repairing infrastructure is a third. And I think that those are very, and energy infrastructure, right, is another one. I would say that where you find almost the complete paralysis or inability to do something that everybody wants done, you're gonna find that it's legalism that's the impediment.
If you look at some of the three kind of sectors of the U.S. economy where that just have outpaced inflation, which would be like healthcare, higher education, and housing, as we just talked about. Those are like the three areas that are most heavily subsidized by the government, but which means that they're also heavily regulated as well. So they also have the most, bureaucracy, red tape, things like that. I mean, what is that? What is like, as the U.S. government tries to make these things more affordable, they end up just not. What's the solution to some of these problems?
Yeah, so I would say that higher education is a little bit different than all the other ones, only because there's something that's never talked about when it comes to the price of higher education, which is that the sticker price has far outpaced inflation, but not the actual price. The actual price of higher education is actually quite in line with the rise of inflation. So people don't know this is like there's the sticker price, which is what universities advertise as how much it costs to go there. But if you take every student at a university and divide how much they pay, like the total amount that is paid by people and the government, and you just divide it across the number of students, it's actually like significantly lower than that. But it's point taken. People feel that it's out of reach, right? And one of the reasons why people feel that it's out of reach is not primarily just about the price. It's because they haven't expanded admissions at the kind of schools that people want to go to. And at the other schools, admissions is like fallen off a cliff because of certain things. So higher education, I would put, it's true that the federal government has, the building issue is not mostly a federal government issue. It's mostly a state and local government problem, especially in the major metropolitan areas. And I do think it has a lot to do with regulation. By the way, regulations, which I kind of like, right? So there are things that I like about the regulations. What I want is more discretion. And I don't think necessarily that means you get rid of the rules. So, we just had a lot of fires here in Southern California that have destroyed, multi-million-dollar neighborhoods. And when you have to rebuild, they're like, okay, well, this is LA. You're not going to be able to rebuild. And so they were like, the state was decided, okay, we'll just decide that we're going to, bypass a lot of the regulations. Good for them. But if you look at some of the things, you still at some of the previous rules, in Malibu, for instance, nobody's on city sewage. There's no city sewage, right? Everybody's on a
septic.
It's on a septic system, right? And because otherwise you would just dump it right out into the ocean. And you can imagine if all of Malibu just decided to flush into Malibu, nobody's going to want to enjoy the beaches in Malibu, right? But if you're in septic in a beach community, that's really tough. But right, if you think about it, like you think about seepage, and you think about there's a lot of stuff that could just run off into the sea. So a lot of the regulations have to do with how you how you install septic systems, etc. If you think about that, you kind of want the rules there, but what do you want the rules to be, right? Do you want the rules there to you cannot build unless there's a compliance and a compliance officer, right? Or do you have the rules be, this is the best practice. If you don't want your own beaches to be filled with your own sewage, this is what the code says. Okay. But now you need to rebuild hundreds and thousands of homes that are there. Do you have the capacity to make sure everybody complies? And to make sure those things are built within 3 years as opposed to 10 years? And the answer is no, we just don't, right? With all of those rules, you're going to need so many people to staff the compliance office and the inspector office. You don't get to build, right? And so what you do is you need to have a little bit of trust, right? You have to have, if you restore trust, then you could have rules and you can have discretion, and you could still have efficiency.
You're saying that a lot of students aren't paying, the quote unquote like full sticker price at education. I guess the first thing that I kind of thought of was I used to live in like Colorado ski towns, and I remember one year the CEO of Vail Resorts, this is at the time when, for the first time, day tickets to ski at Vail, Beaver Creek, etc., exceeded $200 for a lift ticket for the day. And basically his response was like, only idiots. Something to the effect of only idiots actually buy the day pass. No one really buys them because you have season passes or you buy some lodging and maybe you get some deals. But at the end of the day, there's still a lot of people that actually buy
the 200.
Yeah, they still pay the 200. I was thinking, there's students that maybe are on an athletic scholarship or a music scholarship, and they're getting some Pell Grant they don't have to repay. But there's still a lot of students that are actually paying that full sticker price. It's not everyone, but there's still what percentage? Yeah, what percentage are still paying that full sticker price?
So the universities have quietly, and maybe even not so quietly, have adopted a progressive model of tuition where, the reason why they have high sticker prices is they want wealthy people to subsidize the educations of poor people. And by the way, this is how fancy private schools do it, right? Like high schools, right? Boarding schools and stuff, right? They have this number where they're like, okay, we're, Phillips Exeter, but we can't only be educating, the wealthiest of the wealthy, who, by the way, don't even care at all, like that it's whatever it is, 80,000 a year, like if you make, 6.2 million a year, like 80,000 is like relative to my salary. It's kind of like paying, whatever, like my Netflix subscription or something like that. Like I don't care very much about Netflix. It's my Netflix subscription. So private universities have been doing that. That's what they do. And that's the reason why they have the high sticker price. They really actually do want to bill the rich people that amount, right? And they have this progressive model. The thing that state schools, that's a little bit different, right? Because in state school, although they're using that model a little more now, but with state schools, it was just a matter of decreased in state funding, right? When the priorities have gone mostly in state funding to older populations than younger populations. So some people do pay the higher ones. But again, if you take all of the students and you average out what it is, the average payment, like these numbers are out there. Like you could actually see the line looks like it just grows relative to inflation for sticker prices. But then if you look at like how the line grows for what's called the discount rate, right? So the sticker price minus the discount rate, it's actually it's rising actually very slowly.
And then in terms of the housing, what we were discussing, I mean, like NIMBYism in housing is like a major thing where it's like, maybe you're an activist trying to get, low-income housing put in your neighborhood as you're a renter. And then as soon as you buy a house, I mean, you don't want any low-income housing because now it's going to effectively make your house not worth as much, right? So you go from activist to protectionist right overnight. And especially that we have 11,000 baby boomers retiring a week right now. Or is it a day? No, it's 11,000 baby boomers a day are retiring right now, I think, for the next couple of years. And for them, I mean, their biggest asset is their house. I mean, the last thing they want to crater is their home value. And most people look at their house kind of as like a piggy bank. So, and I mean, I've worked for local municipalities. Every single person on town council basically will run under affordable housing, low income. And of course they do the opposite, because they're all homeowners. Of course, they don't want their house to depreciate in value,
Yeah. I mean, to the extent that people can exploit rules and laws in their favor to prevent low-income housing or just housing generally from being built. That's a rule-based problem. But to the extent that it's not that they can exploit it, but actually elected leaders will always bend to the wishes of the property class who want to see their property values, stay a certain way, then that's not a rule problem, right? That is a rule maker's problem, right? And that's sort of the thorniest issue when it comes to democracy, right? Where, there is something for the greater good, right? But people who are democratically, legitimately elected by a lobby that is only self-interested, and as a result of the self-interest, implements things that are a net bad to everybody else. That's a thorny issue. There has been a concerted effort to change the minds of boomers about this, right? And some of it is just greed, right? Like, it's not about whether you can afford your retirement. You can, right? I think that most of them just want more and won't settle for a little bit less in the interests of, a younger generation who can't afford housing anymore, right? So, insofar as the problem is with rules, I'm all for it, right? Better public policy, zoning and building codes to the extent that they prevent, the construction of new housing. Yeah, go get rid of it. Insofar, it's okay. Even if those went away, you're going to have zoning boards and the approval process will favor existing homeowners against the interests of builders and people who can move in. That's not a rule problem anymore. That's a better people problem, right? And how do you change that? That's difficult.
Going back to kind of like, who do you mistrust more to kind of implement these rules would be the humans or the machines. And kind of like, it could be either dystopian with machines, or it could be more utopian, right? Because you could take out a lot of the biases, but then also who's programming these machines? It's the whole like garbage in, garbage out. I mean, you have a bunch of biases, human biases programmed into the machines, and you're going to have a bunch of human biases programmed out. It's going to basically be crap in, crap out, right? I mean, so, and it seems like, of course, I mentioned chapter 6 a few times, coming of the robot rulers, but it seems like that's where we're headed. You're saying possibly, in less than a year. I mean, we already have a lot of this, right? I mean, right? I mean, maybe, or do I get early parole? Well, maybe it's an algorithm that's determining if you get early parole. Your credit score, China obviously has the social credit score, but we've already had this decades ago. The credit score is probably the very first, large scale one.
You know what I imagined, and I don't think it's that far off. Everybody's like internet dating now. So like, what are the aspects of our lives that we've actually handed over to algorithmic adjacent software? So we've choosing restaurants, finding help for our homes, like a gardener or like a housekeeper or a contractor, dating, right? And so forth. So I was thinking about this. I was like, it's not that far off to think that there's going to be programming. I mean, the AI companies are insisting people use this stuff, right? Where you're going to be algorithmically filtered on a dating app, right? Like you're this number when it comes to this dimension. And probably for women, like they just like, I don't want to do a bunch of shit on this thing. So like have the algorithms determine something, right? And so everybody's going to have like a dating score, right? And like this is the world that young people who are dating are going to be like looking at, right? It's already the case in employment, right? So like all the people who are on gig apps are, which I talk about in that chapter, right, are a 4.8 versus a 4.6 versus a 4.4 or whatever the hell that is, right? People who choose their restaurants. Well, like, I don't know if you have a threshold, but like in my family, it's like, well, that's a 4.3. That's below our threshold. We're not going to go to a 4.3 restaurant. We have to at least be a 4.4. Basically, it's essentially doing what I'm talking about, which is outsourcing the entire decision-making process of living to what is a glorified credit score on some dimension, right?
I actually had Professor Charles Goodhart on the podcast a while back, but he's like the Goodhart's law. I'm sure you've heard of that.
Of course.
Basically, like when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become
a good
essentially.
Yeah, that's right.
See, it essentially becomes useless. Yeah. And like when I look at like Airbnb or Uber driver, I don't actually like even care. I've had such bad experiences with Airbnb. We don't even book Airbnbs anymore. I'm not like, if I see a restaurant that has if I'm Googling it and it has like a 3.9, it's not like I'm like, oh, it has a 3.9, I'm gonna not go there. I just assumed that they maybe got photo, or it got not photobombed, but it just got
Jesse,
black,
you're using your judgment, which I like, right? You're using your judgment, right? And that's basically what the argument of the book is, right? So like you have a confidence in your own judgment where you're like, well, I could judge better than this crap, right? The society is headed in the other direction is what I'm saying, right? It's, especially young people, they don't want to write a paper anymore. And I kind of don't blame them. Like their papers were graded by an algorithm. Like nobody fucking read their SAT essay or whatever thing anyways, and like they're never going to develop a judgment for like, if you're reading this, hey kid, do you think it's right? Do you think it's good? Do you think, I don't know. I know how to put it in to ChatGPT and ask it if it thinks it's good, right? Or whatever. You were able to develop an independent set of judgment so that when the algorithm told you wrong, you're like, you know what? If it's a 3.9, I'll take that into consideration. I'm not going to throw it away, but I'm not going to like let it run me, right? And my concern is that, but you had time to develop your judgment without that stuff. And so when it comes into your life, you don't think that you're going to completely defer to it. Credit scores, everybody defers to that, right? Nobody who's a loan officer anywhere is going to be like, well, I'm going to talk to this person anyways, right? If you're below a certain credit score, you're not getting it. You're not getting the loan, right? You're not getting it. It doesn't, that's been completely gone. And I think it's, I don't think it's out of the question that, these poor kids who were like going to even run their personal lives on an app are going to like defend, are they going to like, you know what? I'm tired of this. I'm not going to, exercise my own judgment or learn to make a judgment anymore.
I mentioned that David Grabar's book, The Utopia of Rules, he has what he calls the iron law of liberalism. And of course, he's using liberalism in the classic sense, not, more like the American sense. But anyways, he says that any market reform, any government initiative intended to reduce red tape and promote market forces will have the ultimate effect of increasing the total number of regulations, the total amount of paperwork, and the total number of bureaucrats the government employs. And I guess the question is like, I mean, one, I think it's true, but second,
it's true.
Like, and we often hear about like peak oil or peak whatever. What is peak bureaucracy? And have we hit peak bureaucracy yet in the U.S.?
We haven't hit peak bureaucracy. Peak bureaucracy is China.
It's China, right?
China is peak bureaucracy. We're not there.
How far off are we from peak?
We are. I would hazard that we're closer to that in our healthcare system, in our private healthcare system that's non-governmental, than we are governmentally, actually. But I think there are sectors that are pretty close. Yeah. So I think healthcare, we're very close, if not even over that. Let's see. I think in building, in the cities, in blue states, we are. Oh, you know where we are? We are definitely where China is in homeowners associations.
Yeah.
I think peak bureaucracy and homeowners association is kind of the nightmare scenario where it's not even that bad at cities, but like if you're in like a community that has such a thing, like even in a red state like Florida or something, like there are so many stories of the power of the like the central HOA thing, right? Like it's totalitarian, right? It's like, your roof color and no flags that are bigger than this size, and rules about trick or treating and all this other shit. Like I'm sure they vary. It's not across the board, but there are definitely homeowners associations that are like dystopian. Yeah.
In that book, David Gerber's book, The Utopia of Rules, he has several different essays, but in one of the essays, it's broken down into multiple essays, but one of his theories is that people just love bureaucracy, subconsciously, because it's impersonal. Like you don't have to, you don't really have to have some like high-end conversation with someone. Like that's just the rules are. If you're the employee, you can be like, well, I'd love to help you out, but it's just this, like you mentioned in the book, it's by the book, a bureaucrat.
Yeah.
Like you don't have to use your brain. You don't have to like problem solve. Like, oh my God, like, yeah, let's try to help you. Like, well, nope, rules says this is what we're going to do. Get the fuck out. Like it makes your job a lot easier. And then you just go back to your playing Candy Crush or going back to Facebook. Like they basically just interrupted your Facebook time.
Yeah. I wouldn't put it that way, but I understand the point. So the way that I would put it is there are reasons for why a lot of people push bureaucracy and legalism. And they're exactly the reason that Han-Fei said, right? Which is, if you want to scale anything, you can't trust people to be good overall and across time. If you want to have a fast food restaurant that you're going to open 10 of or 100 of, or in Asia and Russia, you can't just go, all right, now everybody make good burgers, right? No, you're going to source, you're going to make sure every patty's exactly the same size, and you're going to make sure every single clerk says the exact same welcome to everybody who comes into the restaurant. So you build a rule book for it, right? Precisely because you don't want to leave it up to chance that it's going to go awry, like that you're only going to depend on having a good manager, good worker, good sourcing of beef or whatever, right? And so I wouldn't say that people like it more, because I'm not sure that's true. I don't know. But I will say that there are good reasons for things going in that direction.
In that same book, he mentions that after the fall of the USSR and the whole Soviet bloc, which everyone knows that it was Soviet Russia, it was bureaucratic.
Yeah.
There's actually more bureaucrats now than there was, So then I was like, is that true? So I was doing some research into it, and it turns out it's actually true. Like you have more bureaucrats now. Like,
yeah.
That seems messed up. You never would think that though, would you? It's insane to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, Graeber's just so incisive, the way that he puts it is like, so much of bureaucracy is to create a jobs program for more bureaucracy. Right. And look, I am not as, cynical about it. I hate it, but I also see people's reasoning for it. But Graeber's right. But there's just an incredible amount of waste, and it's not just a waste of money. It's a waste of human potential, right? Nobody. Here's what I think. I don't think people fundamentally want to be bureaucrats. I think there are people who want to serve, right? I think there are people who care a lot about water quality and like they are involved in a job of monitoring water quality or food quality or airplane safety. Like this is the federal bureaucracy. There are people who are above them that manage a lot of other things. And then there are reports that they have to write. I don't think, maybe there are some people out there who actually just like the reports and the meetings and the memos and things like that. I don't think that's most people, right? I'm in, I have a sister who's in biotech. And, everybody who's in biotech starts off by going to school because they love the science, right? They love the experiment. But then when you have to go into the work sector, you realize that the scientists are the ones who get laid off all the time. And in order to move ahead, you got to become a manager, right? And that's a bureaucrat. That's not somebody who's in the lab, right? That's somebody who's like, well, what about the funding source for this, that, and the other? And what about the reports and all that stuff? And so there's all of these incentives to push people towards the bureaucracy rather than the fundamental science. But what most people want to do is the science. They just want to do it without being laid off all the time, right? Or an engineer or something. I'm a little bit more hopeful. I think that's actually, most people want to learn to be a judge of good writing, good film. I think most people want to be a judge of good restaurants, right? So I'm more hopeful that way.
I believe is it the economist Robert Gordon, I believe his name was, but he basically says like the real economy since like 1971 really hasn't grown, minus there's a little blip in the 90s with the kind of like the .com boom, and even in Graybar kind of says the same thing. I believe in his book, like debt, the debt book. I've read every Graybar book.
Yeah.
I think he's great.
Yeah,
but basically he says that of course we had massive bureaucracy. Really started, basically he says since the Gilded Age, but it really ramped up in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
But he basically says like almost all the gains in the economy have just gone to bureaucrats. Like we're not really, producing anything special. I think maybe we've had this breakthrough recently in ChatGPT and some things like that. But if you were to have gone into a coma in like 1999 and woken up today, I think you'd be pretty disappointed. I mean, you still had a smartphone in 1999. Of course, it was called like a BlackBerry or a Palm Pilot, but I mean, you still could like send messages on your phone. You could access the internet. You could use the GPS, all that stuff. I mean, you still had the personal computer. I mean, hell, I was at my parents' house. I don't know, like maybe a couple Halloweens ago, and my mom was downstairs still using her Windows 99 computer, and she actually just replaced it like recently, and she's like, well, I just got a laptop because I travel more. But it was like, I mean, that's insane to me though. She's still using that.
I think you're right. And I think that, all of the innovation has come in a lot of time wasting things and not particularly productive things. Like social media is a complete, like that's the biggest stories of the last 20 years. And it's completely like has not increased productivity of any human being. AI, I feel like we're still, the jury's still out on whether that's going to be a productivity increaser or like a decrease.
I said it might, I'm basically, it might be. I'm not even sure if that's the case, but at this point, the jury's still out. Yeah, 100%. I mean, like, 100 agree.
Just talking about home building, there are a lot of very interesting technologies that haven't scaled. I think we could have had 100% clean energy if we put in all of the work in the last 20 years that have only been going on for maybe 5 or 10, right? But there's like in home building, there's all of these technologies that haven't scaled that could have, like. I just saw a little documentary about 3D printed houses that's essentially masonry. That it's like a concrete printer, right? That's interesting, but that's just starting. There was no reason why we could have had that 20 years ago, and had that scale. It's just because all of the resources have gone on to just incredibly time wasting things.
Speaking of having this 100% clean energy, whatever, I had a podcast with a guy who worked for NASA and developed space rockets and stuff. I was talking about like space mining, but he basically was saying like, we could have had solar panels up in space 8 decades ago, and then just beam down the energy. And of course, when they're up there, they're so much closer to the sun. You have the atmosphere. And he's like, we could do that decades ago. He's like,
the technology is really old.
He's like, this stuff's old. Like, it's not that hard. It's really just a matter of regulation. Do you want to do it?
Do you want to do it or you don't? And there was no incentive to do it because of fossil fuel industry.
Right. He's like, well, not just the fossil. I mean, like, who's one of the biggest funders of solar panels? It's still the Koch brothers. They fund both sides, right? I mean, like, they get solar panels up when it gets dark. You run the gas plant to even out the grid. Like, they're funding both sides of it. You know, like, it's not like
they have an incentive for the existing power grid to be.
They have do they support nuclear? No, because it doesn't, like, that would then take them out of business. But they support solar because it augments the natural gas. I mean, Well, we'll do one more question before we wrap it up. As someone that actually, I've worked in law enforcement, and so someone that actually has worked in the law enforcement kind of field, I have a little bit of insights. But I thought that one of the interesting things that you wrote was basically that, and I think most people would probably be surprised by this, but basically 95% of cases never even go to trial, right? They're just kind of, they just, you know, the prosecutor and the defense kind of make some deal. And yet, like, the actual arbitrariness, like, you're talking about, like, you know, certain states, like I worked in Colorado where you have, you know, for like a domestic violence DV, someone basically is getting arrested, right? Mandatory arrest. Other states don't, but, you know, that kind of, some of those policies kind of trickle down. But in law, like you actually have like a lot of rules, but then there's still so much kind of gray area or whether people are going to interpret them. You talked about some of the cases in there where it's just like the whole thing is just absolutely insane.
Yeah. It's funny, you know, law enforcement and certain areas of it are so highly discretionary. And that's where you get all of this variability. Like, most of the people who are concerned with, you know, we don't have equal justice for all. We have selective justice for some. Yeah, that's the system, actually, right? That's why you have variation. So, you know, prosecutors. So I have a whole chapter about prosecutors, a chapter about policing, a chapter about prosecutors, and a chapter about judges. Prosecutors are like the most powerful people in a society. They have, you know, what justice is in this country isn't trial by jury, fact finding. It is two people sitting in a room saying, what do you got on my client? Well, I got this. I can do this to him. Well, I'll fight you on that, but I won't fight you on this. Okay, we'll just have a deal. You know, that's justice. And that's the only thing that keeps a country with this much incarceration, like, not grinding to a halt. Like, it would grind to a halt if everybody went to trial. But I think there's a really good question about whether that is or is not justice, that we could just ask. Because this is a philosophy book. You can ask that question, right? You know, we don't have to answer it practically. We could say, is justice, or should it be a matter of two individuals with varying different degrees of power, with the same information, trying to bargain out what's going to happen to somebody else's life, right? Just like bargaining for a car or whatever. But that's exactly what prosecutorial discretion has given us. Just the sheer amount of discretion that prosecutors have given them that kind of power. And, you know, what I write about in that chapter is just how different people use it differently. Right. Some people use it for harsher punishments for people. Some people do it for less harsh punishments for people. Some people pursue cases that other ones don't pursue. That kind of inequality of justice is kind of just built in to the system.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was talking to one of my former coworkers yesterday. He's been a cop since 1983 in Boulder, Colorado. He was actually second on scene in the John Benet Ramsey murder. But anyways, I was asking him, I'm like, who do you think's the most powerful person in the whole legal system? Is it the judge? Is it the DA? Is it the Is it the other parts of the courts, the jury, And he's like, oh, no. He's like, it's not even close. He's like, of course it's the DA. He's like, they have the power not even to take it to trial.
That's right.
Like you can take out the judge, the jury, everyone, basically.
That's right. Yeah.
And then I was like, well, what do you think about the fact that it's in most municipalities, it's an elected position?
Yeah.
So usually the DA is kind of a reflection of the community. If you have a community that's hard on crime, well, then we're going to vote in a hard on crime DA. If we're in a community where we, want to be a little bit softer, well, then, so and then of course the whims could change. Like, oh, actually, maybe in 10 years from now, what used to be, maybe that's no longer the case. And now the DA is completely different.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's a political position. So maybe the DA wants to make an example of someone, good or bad, depending on if it's going to benefit their reelection. But then is that like a system we want? Or do we just want a system that's a little bit more like clear cut? Because these things could change from year to year.
My guess is that my impression is that it's not that way in Europe, right? You don't have like elected district attorneys, lead prosecutors, and definitely you don't have elected judges in but we have elected judges in some places too, right? And which makes it a political position, which we can argue a lot about, right? Whether democracy is a good way to choose somebody in that position.
Right. Yeah. And I think a lot of places, like in terms of law enforcement, who's usually the most lenient? Well, usually it's the sheriff's office. Well, why? Because they're elected. Like if every person in the county got a DUI, you think they're going to reelect that sheriff? Like,
yeah. There you go. Yeah. I mean, yeah, there should be you should make a whole other episode about what should be democratically determined and what shouldn't be. And I could connect you to some political philosophers who have a lot to say about it, this kind of stuff. There's some really anti-democracy philosophers coming out nowadays, which is not surprising because the last 10 years or so of voting doesn't seem a particularly good way of selecting things worldwide, not just in the United States, but like Brexit was like sort of the beginning.
People right now are talking about like Trump and like the whole Doge thing. I mean, Trump won the popular vote. He won the electoral college. Some people are upset with it, but it's like, he's basically doing what he said he was going to do.
It was pretty clear from the get-go.
I think a lot of people have this in their mind that only a bureaucrat, though, can be part of the government. I mean, the corporations are bureaucracies.
Oh, my God.
And a lot of you have someone that's working in some private sector that's like, I mean, who knows? There's some... maybe they're like a corporate attorney or whatever. They probably think they're not a bureaucrat. They are. Like, you're a bureaucrat.
100%.
Right. So they're probably like, but because it's a federal employee, all of a sudden, well, that's a bureaucrat. Like I'm a professional. I'm a distinguished professional. Like, no, you're also a bureaucrat. I think
you're a bureaucrat.
People kind of have like this misconception, like only bureaucrats are government employees. Like, no, the private sector is loaded with them.
Oh my God. Enormously. I think it's right and fair for citizens to demand that if their tax dollars are funding certain things, that they should get a certain level of service in return. I think that's fair. And I think there are good ways to achieve that and not so good ways to achieve that. But the whole thing about the private sector is like, people just give it a pass, right? Except that, you might give it a pass because you're a free market person. Like, oh, well, I don't have to use this kind of service if I don't want to, so I'll just give it a pass. But is that really true? Like, can you really give up telecommunications? Like, do you like the way you're treated by, Verizon or whoever your wireless carrier is? Like, I don't, right? And I don't like how everything is being automated, so I can't talk to a person anymore. Even when I call the freaking sporting goods store, I can't get a person on the phone. Yeah. So is it really just a matter of, oh, well, then just stop shopping at your sporting goods store? Like, I don't even know if that's true anymore. Like, especially in the tech sector, everything has become a monopoly, right? Like, there is no other way for you to do certain things other than do through Google or also these tech companies. And yeah, they're incredibly bureaucratic. Like, try to get something done at Facebook, for instance. If you don't like I don't like any of the way that they serve me a bunch of AI garbage in my feed. What am I going to do? right? Who am I going to go through? There is just no service.
Right. And then you're like, well, instead of going through Facebook, I'll just use Instagram. Oh, wait, they own Instagram, right?
Yeah, there you go. That's right.
I mean, my alternative is the same company.
Yeah.
Today's guest has been Barry Lam, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of California at Riverside. He is the author of the new book, Fewer Rules, Better People, The Case for Discretion. So, Barry, just let people know where we can find you, get a hold of your book. You also have a podcast. Let people know where they can find that podcast, that kind of information. And then secondly, leave us with a final thought related to this podcast or whatever you're working on next, whatever's on your mind, etc.
Sure. Fewer Rules, Better People is available everywhere. You get it on Amazon. Just go to the Norton website. That's the publisher, and they can link you to every place that they are selling the book. Hi-Phi Nation is a show about philosophy that turns stories into ideas from Slate Magazine. Hi-Phi Nation is going to be releasing its 7th season in a few months. I've been on hiatus because of this book. You can find me hiphination.org, HIPHI nation.org. The show's a fun show. It's not academic. It's very it's more of a news magazine-y show. And if I had to leave one thought to everybody is whenever you are setting a rule somewhere, whether it's for your child, about chores, or in the workplace, go for a vague rule that requires people to make a judgment. Things like you will mow the lawn in a reasonable amount of time, or so for my students, turn in a paper of about 1,000 words, right? I don't need to tell you the minimum or maximum. Use your judgment. Sometimes people will get it wrong, but you want people to develop a kind of judgment for everything that they do. That's what being a human being is. And don't let the rules take over your own thinking, just like with Jesse, right? Don't let numbers and metrics determine everything that you do in your life.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.